The room went quiet the moment she stepped onto the range. Not the polite quiet of people paying attention. The other kind. The kind where 200 soldiers stop what they're doing because something doesn't compute, and their brains need a second to catch up. She was 5'4", maybe 130 pounds in full gear. She carried her rifle like she'd been born holding it, which nobody there believed yet, because nobody there knew anything about her except what they could see. And what they could see didn't fit. Her name was Brennan, Captain Lena Brennan, and she had driven 4 hours from Quantico to this base outside of Tulsa on a Tuesday morning in November, alone, with orders that nobody on this base had requested. The commanding officer, Colonel Dex Harlan, had read those orders twice. Then he'd called his aide in and had the aide read them. Then he'd folded the paper in half and told his aide to go find Sergeant Major Coyle, because Coyle had been doing this for 22 years and might know what to do with a situation that did not, on its surface, make any sense. Coyle arrived. He read the orders. He said nothing for a long moment. "She's here to evaluate the long-range qualification program," Harlan said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he's hoping someone will correct him. Coyle didn't correct him. What the orders said, in the flat bureaucratic language that the Army uses when it wants to say something enormous in the smallest possible space, was that Captain Brennan had been embedded with JSOC for 3 years, that she held a classification that neither Harlan nor Coyle were cleared to ask about, and that she was here in an advisory capacity at the direct request of a general whose name sat above both of their pay grades by a distance that felt almost philosophical. What the orders did not say, what nobody on that base would know until later, was that Lena Brennan had, 14 months earlier, taken a shot at 1,100 meters in a crosswind of 22 knots that had ended a hostage situation in a country that officially didn't require the presence of American personnel. She had taken that shot in the dark. She had taken it through a window the size of a dinner plate. She had been lying in 2 inches of mud for 6 hours before she pulled the trigger. The debrief afterward had lasted 9 days. None of this was visible on her face when she walked onto the qualification range that Tuesday morning. What was visible was that she was a woman, that she was smaller than everyone expected, and that the man who had designed this program, Sergeant Major Vince Coyle, had not been told she was coming. Coyle had designed this program. It was his. He had spent 2 years building it from the ground up, incorporating wind correction protocols that he'd developed himself, training schedules that had raised qualification scores across the battalion by 31%. He had written the manual. He had trained the instructors. He had stood on this range 5 days a week for the better part of a year and turned soldiers into marksmen. He looked at Lena Brennan the way a man looks at something that is about to critique the thing he loves most. "Captain," he said when she approached. He said it the way you say a word when you're trying to decide how much respect to put into it. "Sergeant Major." She extended her hand. He shook it. Brief, professional. Neither of them smiled. "You want a walkthrough of the program?" "Not yet," she said. "I'd like to watch a qualification run first. See it as the soldiers see it." Coyle's jaw moved slightly. It was the kind of movement that means something is being swallowed rather than said. "We have a cohort running qualification tomorrow morning. 12 candidates. I'll be here," she said. She was. She stood off to the side of the range at 6 in the morning with a notebook and a pen and watched 12 soldiers work through a qualification sequence that Coyle had built with genuine care and genuine expertise. She did not interrupt. She did not comment. She wrote things down in small, precise handwriting that nobody could see, and she watched the way a person watches who is looking for something specific and knows they'll find it. Coyle watched her watch his soldiers. He didn't like it. He couldn't have explained exactly why, except that it felt like being graded, and nobody who had been in this army for 22 years and had earned the rank he'd earned expected to be graded by someone who looked like she'd graduated from college 6 months ago. She hadn't. She was 31. She had a master's degree in applied mathematics from Penn State that she'd completed while simultaneously completing Ranger School, a combination so improbable that her professors at Penn State had assumed she was making up the Ranger part, and her instructors at Ranger School had assumed she was making up the Penn State part. Both groups had eventually been proven wrong. None of this was information Coyle had. What Coyle had was an impression, and the impression was of someone small and young and female looking at his work with a notebook. That afternoon, she asked to meet with him. They sat in the small office he kept near the armory. It smelled like gun oil and old coffee, which was exactly how it had smelled for the last 6 years and which Coyle found appropriate. She set her notebook on the table between them. She had a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "The program is well built," she said. "The fundamentals are solid. The scheduling is good. The physical conditioning component before qualification is exactly right." He waited for the but. "The wind correction protocol needs to be updated." There it was. "The protocol works," he said. Even as he said it, he heard how it sounded, defensive. He filed that away and kept his voice level. "Scores are up 31%. Scores are up against the previous baseline," she said, which was built around an outdated correction formula. "If you're training to the old formula, a 31% improvement still leaves you short of where you should be. What formula are you using?" She opened the notebook and turned it to face him. There were equations on the page. Real ones. Not the simplified field versions that get printed in manuals, but the actual physics. The Magnus effect, the Coriolis contribution at distance, a Mach number correction she'd derived herself based on data from 3 different testing environments. Coyle looked at the equations. He had 22 years. He was genuinely skilled. He was also honest enough with himself in that moment to know that he was looking at something that was beyond what he'd been working with. He looked up at her. "Where did you develop this?" "Quantico, and then field tested over 2 years. She paused. "I can run you through the derivation if you want." He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said, "Let me think about it." What happened next happened because Coyle was a man who, despite his genuine skill and genuine investment in his work, had a specific weakness. The weakness was not stupidity. It was not laziness. It was the particular blindness that comes from having been right for a very long time. When you have been right for 22 years, it becomes difficult to locate the edge of what you know, because that edge has never mattered before. He talked to his instructors that evening. He talked about the captain from Quantico. He talked about the equations. He talked about it in the way that someone talks about something when they're trying to build a case without admitting they're building a case. His lead instructor, a staff sergeant named Kepler, said, "She probably got those equations from a textbook." He said it the way people say things when they want their superior to agree, and they can feel that their superior wants to agree, and the most useful thing they can do is make it easy. Coyle didn't correct him. The next morning, he found Brennan on the range. She was already there, an hour before anyone else, lying in a prone position at the 600-meter station with a rifle she'd brought herself. She was doing something with a small weather instrument, measuring something, recording it. "Captain," he said. She looked up. Got to her feet. She moved efficiently, no wasted motion. "I'd like to run a demonstration," he said, "side by side. My protocol, your protocol, same conditions, same distance." She looked at him for a moment. "What distance?" 800 meters. "Okay," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow," in front of the cohort. She understood what he was doing. She understood it precisely because she had been in rooms where people did this, where the implicit argument was, "Let's settle this publicly, because if I'm right, it's over, and if you're right, I need to see it with my own eyes before I can accept it." She didn't think less of him for it. She thought it was actually more honest than most of the alternatives. "Fine," she said. Word traveled. By the following morning, it wasn't just the 12-person cohort that showed up to the range. It was most of the battalion, 200 soldiers, some of whom had specifically gotten up earlier than required, had gotten their coffee, had told their bunkmates because something was going to happen today that felt like it was worth watching. Coyle was aware of this. He stood at the line with the particular posture of a man who has done something that cannot be undone, and who is now waiting to find out whether that thing was a mistake. Brennan stood 6 feet to his left. She had her own rifle. She had her notebook, which she'd converted into a small laminated card that she tucked into her front pocket. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the target. She looked at the flags along the range that showed the wind direction. She looked at her weather instrument, which she'd set up on a small tripod beside her position, 800 meters. At that distance, the bullet is in the air for almost a full second. At that distance, a 10-knot wind, the wind that day, moves the point of impact by roughly 15 inches. At that distance, the mathematics of the shot matter more than the mechanics of it, because the mechanics are something a trained soldier can execute, but the mathematics have to be right before the trigger is pulled. Coyle's protocol gave a correction of 11 inches. His formula was based on a simplified drag model that had been standard for most of his career. It was not wrong exactly, it was approximate. Brennan's calculation, which she worked out in under 2 minutes using the data from her weather instrument and the equations in her notebook, gave a correction of 17 inches. The difference was 6 inches. At 800 meters, 6 inches is the difference between a hit and a miss. It is not a close call. It is not a matter of interpretation. Coyle shot first. He was a good shot. He was genuinely skilled in a way that 200 soldiers around him respected and that his record supported. He applied his correction. He controlled his breathing. He pulled the trigger with 22 years of muscle memory behind it. The round impacted 3 inches low and left of center. There was a silence. Then Brennan settled into her position. She made one small adjustment to her scope that she didn't explain. She stilled completely, the kind of stillness that is not effort but absence. The absence of everything in a person except attention. 200 soldiers watched her and did not speak. She pulled the trigger. The range had a spotting screen. The impact showed in the upper right quadrant of the circle. Not dead center, she had applied a correction for a subtle shift in wind direction that she detected in the last 30 seconds before the shot, which had moved her slightly, but inside the scoring ring. Inside it cleanly. The silence lasted longer than it should have. 200 people processing something that did not fit the category they'd already assigned to her. Coyle stood up slowly. He was looking at the spotting screen. He did not look at her for a long moment, and when he did, his face had the expression of someone who has just found the edge of what they know, and are standing on it and finding it solid. "Walk me through the derivation," he said. It was the 6 words she'd been waiting for since the conversation in his office. Not because she needed to be right, not because she needed him to say it, but because those 6 words were the thing that made the rest of it possible. The updating of the protocol, the retraining of the instructors, the improvement of scores for every soldier who would come through this program in the years ahead. She said, "Let's go inside." She spent 4 hours that afternoon sitting with Coyle and his 3 lead instructors, working through the mathematics on a whiteboard in a room that smelled like gun oil and old coffee. She went slowly. She stopped to answer questions. She did not make anyone feel stupid for asking them. When Kepler, the staff sergeant, pushed back on one of the intermediate steps and said he thought the simplified version produced results that were close enough to be practically equivalent, she didn't argue with him directly. She said, "Let's run the numbers for 1,000 meters in a 15-knot wind and see what close enough looks like." They ran the numbers. The difference was 9 inches. Kepler stopped pushing back. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the painstaking, unglamorous, mostly invisible work of changing a training program in an institution that has strong preferences about not changing things. Brennan worked 14-hour days. She rewrote sections of the manual. She ran clinics for the instructors. She stood on the range in temperatures that dropped into the 30s and demonstrated repeatedly, patiently, the protocol she was asking people to adopt. She did this without making it about her. When a qualification score improved, she said it was because the soldier had executed correctly. When someone struggled, she worked with them, not above them. When Coyle made a suggestion about the scheduling component, a good suggestion, actually, she incorporated it without comment, because it was a good suggestion and the program was more important than who had made it. By the end of the 3rd week, the cohort that had been training under the new protocol ran qualification. The average score was 11% above the previous record. 2 soldiers who had failed qualification twice under the old protocol passed under the new one. Coyle watched the scores come in. He was standing next to Brennan at the range, and when the last number went up on the board, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the formula you derived, the Mach correction. You did that at Quantico? Most of it, she said. Some of it I worked out in the field. Where? She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not evasion, exactly. It was the look of someone deciding how much of a thing is theirs to share. Somewhere I can't name, she said, but it was a long shot in a crosswind. He nodded. He didn't ask more. 22 years in the Army had taught him to recognize the shape of classified, and he respected it the way he respected most things, at a distance. You've done this before, he said. Walked into a program and changed it. Once or twice. They push back every time? She almost smiled. Every time. He was quiet for another moment. Around them, soldiers were clearing their lanes, breaking down their equipment, talking in the low voices of people who have just done something well and know it. The afternoon light was going flat and gray in the way it does in Oklahoma. In November, the sky closing down from the edges. The cohort the first day, Coyle said, when you were watching them run the sequence. You already knew, before we ran the demonstration. I suspected, she said, but you let me set up the demonstration. You needed to see it yourself, she said. Reading an equation isn't the same as watching it land. He absorbed that. There was something in it that he would think about later, alone, in the way that things said at the right moment tend to stay with a person. He said, I owe you an apology. She turned to look at him. Not for the demonstration, he said. I think that was fair, actually. I mean, the way I talked about you. To my instructors before, I was building a case before I'd run the math. That wasn't right. The range had gone almost empty around them. A few soldiers in the distance, the flags moving in the cold wind, the last light going out of the sky. She said, you ran the math eventually. That's not the same thing. No, she admitted, it's not. But it's what matters. He nodded slowly, with the posture of a man accepting something he doesn't fully agree with but is willing to live with. That evening, she sat in the small room the base had assigned her and wrote a report for the general who had sent her. The report was 5 pages. It described the program, the protocol update, the results. It recommended that the new formula be adopted across all long-range qualification programs in the region, and that Coyle be identified as a subject matter expert for the transition, because a man who could update 22 years of practice in 3 weeks when shown the data was exactly the kind of person an institution needed when it was trying to get better. She did not write about the first day on the range, or the silence of 200 soldiers, or the 6-word sentence that had changed everything. She did not write about the apology. Those things were real, but they belonged to the range and to the cold November air, and they were not the kind of thing that improved by being put in a report. She closed the laptop. She looked at the window, at the darkness outside. She had one more day on this base. Then she had orders to a post in Georgia, where there was another program, another cohort, another room full of people who would look at her the way Coyle had looked at her on the first morning, and who would come around or not, based on whether they could find the edge of what they knew and stand on it long enough to see past it. She had learned, over the years, not to take the looking personally. It was data, like the wind speed and the Mach number and the angle of the shot. You factored it in. You adjusted. You pulled the trigger anyway. The thing about a long shot in a crosswind is that the conditions are never perfect. They are never what you would choose. You work with what is there, the wind that is actually blowing, the light that is actually available, the target that is actually in front of you, and you apply everything you know, and then you get very still, and you let it go. She turned off the light. Outside, Oklahoma was dark and cold, and somewhere on the range, the flags were still moving in the wind.